On June 4th, the White House announced a dramatic escalation. U.S. aluminum tariffs would double to 50%, the steepest in modern history. Import volumes, once surging, collapsed to their lowest since 2022. Ford warned of $3 billion in extra costs this year, while Molson Coors braced for higher can prices. Meanwhile, Canadian producers quietly shifted shipments to Europe, securing billion-dollar contracts. The tension is clear. What happens when a tariff meant to protect American industry instead accelerates its decline and strengthens its closest neighbor? For decades, the US and Canada built one of the world's most deeply integrated aluminum supply chains. American car makers, brewers, and construction firms relied heavily on Canadian smelters, while Canada counted on US buyers to absorb the lion's share of its output. Quebec's hydropower-fed industry became North America's anchor for green aluminum, and US manufacturers benefited from stable, competitively priced imports that supported millions of downstream jobs. It was a relationship born of geography, energy, and trust. But the foundations began to crack as protectionist politics rose in Washington. The Trump administration revived tariffs as a tool of leverage, arguing they would revive America's dwindling smelting capacity down to just 6 primary plants by 2025 from 24 at the start of the century. Yet history offered a warning. The 2018 metals tariffs had delivered only modest relief to domestic smelters, while costing downstream industries an estimated 75,000 jobs. By spring 2025, tensions deepened. Imports surged in anticipation of new duties, then collapsed after June 4th, when tariffs doubled to 50%. US firms like Ford and Molson Coors sounded alarms over billions in added costs. Canada, for its part, saw an opening and prepared to turn America's own barriers into an unexpected advantage. Washington's gamble was bold, but also deeply risky. On June 4th, 2025, the White House doubled aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50%, marking one of the most aggressive trade measures in recent memory. Officials framed it as a national security issue, echoing earlier rhetoric about safeguarding critical industries. The stated goal was clear: revive a once mighty domestic smelting sector that had shrunk to just 6 plants, 4 operating at partial capacity compared to more than 20 in the year 2000. By choking off foreign supply, tariffs were supposed to breathe life into US production. But the realities of modern aluminum were unforgiving. Restarting an idled smelter costs upwards of $100 million and takes nearly a year, according to Alcoa. New plants would require massive capital, about $35 billion, to cover the 4 million tons of annual deficit, and cheap, long-term electricity contracts at or below $40 per megawatt hour. With data centers and renewable projects competing for power, those conditions simply didn't exist. Instead of new investment, the immediate effect was sticker shock. Midwest premiums, the benchmark for aluminum buyers, spiked to $0.615 per pound on June 9th, then soared past $0.68 by mid-July, briefly topping $0.70 for August contracts. For manufacturers, this translated into billions in new costs. Ford reported $800 million in additional expenses in the second quarter alone, revising annual forecasts downward by $3 billion. Molson Coors warned of a $40 to $55 million hit for 2025 as can prices surged. Beverage companies, automakers, construction firms all faced shrinking margins. Recycling became a lifeline since scrap aluminum was exempt from tariffs and required only 5% of the energy needed to produce primary metal. Imports of scrap rose sharply as buyers scrambled to secure alternatives. Yet while recyclers benefited, the broader U.S. industrial landscape groaned under the weight of its own policy. The administration had promised revival, but the numbers pointed to strain. Imports of primary aluminum plunged from 442,000 tons in March to just 268,000 tons in May, the lowest since 2022. What was meant as protection looked increasingly like self-inflicted damage. North of the border, Canada read the moment differently. Rather than panic, producers pivoted. Quebec, home to nearly 90% of the nation's aluminum, wielded an advantage Washington could not match: abundant, low-cost hydropower. Companies like Aluminerie Alouette, the largest smelter in North America, had already secured electricity contracts through 2045, underpinned by a $1.5 billion investment plan. This allowed Canadian producers to market green aluminum, low carbon, competitively priced, and highly attractive to buyers under pressure to decarbonize. With U.S. buyers squeezed by a 50% tariff, Canadian producers redirected output to Europe and beyond. Reuters reported shipments of 11,800 tons to the Netherlands in April and 25,500 tons to Italy in May, while Alcoa alone rerouted more than 100,000 tons out of the US market. For European buyers, the timing was perfect. The EU's decarbonization agenda prized green metals, and Canadian supply offered a clean, reliable alternative at a moment when American premiums were soaring. Contracts once dominated by U.S. distributors were now flowing to Europe, locking in long-term relationships that would be difficult to unwind. Domestically, Canada strengthened its position by turning Washington's wall into a springboard. Producers leaned into branding, highlighting their ESG credentials and low emissions. Canadian officials seized the narrative, presenting the aluminum industry as both an economic and environmental asset. Ottawa also moved strategically in global trade, pursuing the kind of partnerships that Washington had just forged with South Korea. By contrast to Seoul's deal, tariffs trimmed to 15% in exchange for $350 billion in investment and $100 billion in U.S. energy purchases, Canada offered no concessions. Instead, it diversified outward, courting European and Asian buyers while investing in recycling and infrastructure at home. The result was striking. Where the U.S. aimed to isolate supply, Canada globalized its market share. Far from being cornered, Ottawa turned the tariff into leverage, deepening ties abroad and cementing its role as a trusted supplier of low-carbon aluminum. Washington's barrier, intended to strengthen domestic industry, had instead created openings that Canada exploited with precision. Both nations now face a stalemate that neither side can easily escape. For the United States, tariffs were meant to signal strength, but they exposed the structural weakness of an industry too costly and power-hungry to revive quickly. Consumers and businesses bear the brunt: higher car prices, costlier beer cans, and inflated construction budgets. Politically, rolling back tariffs risks appearing weak, while keeping them in place deepens the squeeze on households already battling inflation. For Canada, success abroad comes with its own risks. Redirecting aluminum to Europe and Asia strengthens long-term diversification, but dependence on foreign buyers beyond the U.S. also carries volatility. Meanwhile, Ottawa cannot ignore the reality that the United States remains its largest single customer. An extended rift could dampen growth and spark political backlash at home. The standoff is less about economics than perception. Washington insists tariffs are leverage, while Ottawa insists they are opportunity. Yet both sides remain trapped in a cycle where pride collides with pragmatism, and the North American aluminum market sits precariously at the edge of a reset. For Canada, the aluminum tariffs presented both windfalls and growing pains. Quebec's smelters, powered by hydropower and marketed as green aluminum, found enthusiastic buyers in Europe. Contracts with the Netherlands and Italy proved that Ottawa could pivot quickly, while companies like Aluminerie Alouette locked in decades of cheap electricity, securing their global competitiveness. The industry's confidence surged, buoyed by headlines of Canadian aluminum stepping into EU supply chains just as US buyers were locked out by their own tariffs. Yet, underneath the optimism lay disruption. Exporters accustomed to shipping south had to overhaul logistics. Instead of short rail routes to American buyers, producers were coordinating complex shipping to European ports. Smaller Canadian suppliers without the capital or scale to pivot struggled. Some communities dependent on cross-border trade saw layoffs as distribution networks shrank. The cost of rerouting, insurance, freight, and warehousing cut into margins. And while green aluminum branding drew premiums abroad, Canada risked losing its dominance in the US market if political standoffs persisted. For every headline celebrating European deals, there were quieter stories of Canadian workers caught in transition. The tariffs had given Ottawa leverage, but they also reshaped livelihoods, reminding Canadians that diversification often comes at a steep human cost. For the United States, the pain was sharper and more visible. Aluminum buyers faced soaring premiums, with Midwest prices surging past 70 cents per pound in August. Automakers, beverage companies, and construction firms passed costs onto consumers. Ford alone reported $800 million in added expenses in Q2, projecting $3 billion for the year. Molson Coors warned of a $40 to $55 million hit to 2025 profits, driven almost entirely by higher can costs. What was framed in Washington as industrial revival became, for American households, pricier cars, beer, and appliances. The tariff wall also exposed structural weakness. With only 6 primary smelters left, restarting production was prohibitively expensive. Alcoa estimated it would take $100 million and nearly a year to restart a single line, and even then, cheap electricity was nowhere in sight. The gap, 4 million tons annually, was impossible to close quickly. Meanwhile, imports of scrap surged as recyclers scrambled to fill the void, but recycling alone could not meet demand. For U.S. communities tied to downstream industries, the policy felt like déjà vu. The 2018 metal tariffs had cost an estimated 75,000 net jobs in manufacturing. 2025 threatened a repeat. Washington's attempt to protect aluminum smelting had instead transferred wealth from workers and consumers to higher premiums and foreign competitors. The tariff meant to build resilience had only deepened vulnerability. North America's aluminum story now hangs in balance. The United States, straining under tariffs that fuel inflation and punish its own industries, faces an industry too expensive to revive. Canada, seizing the moment with hydropower-fed green aluminum, wins ground in Europe, but risks alienating its largest partner. What began as protection has become fracture. The question is unavoidable. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart when trying to go it alone? You are American or Canadian? Share your story and perspective in the comments below.